"This is a man's job, Miss Tarrant." The words fell more quietly than an insult ought to have done, and perhaps that was why they struck so cleanly. On the 3rd of November, 1858, Ewbank Hall was already alive with rent-day business before the weak Derbyshire light had fully reached the lower windows. Estate clerks moved between long tables with ledgers tucked beneath their arms. Tenant representatives waited near the panelled walls, hats held respectfully against their coats. A pair of mine accounts lay open beside a stack of lease papers, and somewhere beyond the entrance court a groom called to a restless horse while wheels grated over damp gravel. At the centre of it all stood Rufus Westersdale, Duke of Ashminster, recently returned to Ewbank and already surrounded by the work of a man determined to prove that nothing under his authority would escape his attention. In one hand, he held an unsigned 18-page report entitled Report on Relief Payments and Deductions at Blackmere. In the other, he held a pencil with which he had marked 3 passages in the margin. "Whoever prepared this has discipline," he said, looking down at the pages rather than at the people around him. No melodrama, no attempt to enlarge a grievance by ornament. Figures, dates, names, and a conclusion that follows from them. Peter Fossett stood on the opposite side of the table with the contained expression of a man who had been praised and found the praise inconvenient. At 43, Fossett had the polished sobriety of someone who understood precisely how respectable a dark coat and careful voice could make him appear. As the commercial lessee of Blackmere Mine, he had come expecting discussion of the renewal of his lease. He had not expected the Duke to spend the first quarter hour admiring an anonymous report that questioned how Blackmere's widow relief had been administered. "Some clerk with too much time, perhaps, Your Grace," Peter said, "or one of those reforming gentlemen who enjoy figures more than they understand industry." Rufus turned another page. "A clerk who understands subtraction better than most men understand their own interests." A few of the estate clerks lowered their eyes to hide faint smiles. Lilian Tarrant did not. She stood several paces away beside the Dowager Duchess's chair, one gloved hand resting lightly upon the back of it. She was 32, neither young enough to be indulged for speaking rashly, nor old enough to be granted the harmless authority society sometimes allowed unmarried women who had survived being overlooked for several decades. Her dark grey morning dress was well made but unremarkable. That suited her. At Ewbank, people often noticed that Miss Tarrant was composed before they noticed anything else about her. It had become useful to her. The Dowager Duchess had paused in the lower hall on her way to the morning room, because rent day at Ewbank always attracted a certain theatre of anxiety, loyalty, complaint, and calculation. Lilian had expected to stand with her for only a few minutes. She had not expected to see the report in the Duke's hands. The original report, the estate solicitor had promised that it would be placed before His Grace without the author's name. He had kept that promise. Rufus tapped one paragraph with the pencil. "Here, widow relief awarded, £3. Cash received, £1 11 shillings. The remainder appears against cottage rent and company charges." Peter's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Which is not unusual, Your Grace. Families often ask for accounts to be settled directly, particularly women who find bookkeeping difficult after a husband's death." Lilian's gaze moved to him. Peter noticed. He had noticed her twice already that morning. The first time had been when Rufus mentioned the totals. The second had been when Peter referred to the widows as confused. This time, his attention lingered. There are always complaints when grief and money are mixed, Peter continued. A widow remembers what she expected to receive, not necessarily what she agreed should be deducted. That would explain one case, Rufus said, not 7 arranged in precisely the same fashion. Peter smiled without warmth. 7 women can misunderstand the same arrangement. Lilian heard herself speak before caution had quite caught up with judgment. Not if one of them received less cash than the relief statement itself records. The lower hall seemed to contract by a few inches. Rufus lifted his eyes from the report. Until then, he had scarcely looked at her directly. His attention settled now, with the weight of rank and habit behind it. "I beg your pardon?" Lilian felt the Dowager Duchess glance toward her, not in warning, but in interest. Peter's expression changed more quickly. Not fear, calculation. Lilian kept her voice even. "The figure your Grace just read aloud was £3 in relief, and £1, 11 shillings in cash. That is not the only discrepancy. The widow in question was not given the balance in another form that she recognized as relief." Peter's gaze sharpened. And how would Miss Tarrant know what a Blackmere widow recognized? The question was mild enough to pass as curiosity. Lilian heard the challenge beneath it. Rufus looked from Peter to her. "Have you some connection with Blackmere?" "I have spoken with people who live there." Socially. The word was not cruel, but it carried the assumption that whatever she had done could be placed inside a category suited to women: visiting, charity, sympathy. Something soft enough not to interfere with the men's papers. Not precisely. Peter gave a quiet breath that might almost have been a laugh. "Your Grace, Blackmere accounts are not drawing-room arithmetic. There are cottage charges, advances, coal allowances, burial expenses, relief sums, arrears, and deductions. A figure can appear simple while the agreement beneath it is not." Lilian looked at him. "That is usually why one reads the agreement beneath it." One of the clerks bent suddenly over his ledger. Rufus did not smile. He seemed more surprised than amused. His gaze returned to the report, then to Lilian. For a moment she thought he might ask the obvious question. Instead, Peter spoke first. "Miss Tarrant means well, I'm sure." That was worse than mockery. It was reduction delivered with courtesy. Lilian felt her fingers tighten once against the chair and then relax. Rufus drew a slow breath. He had the look of a man who disliked disorder and had decided where to place it. "This is a man's job, Miss Tarrant. You need not trouble yourself with it." There was no laughter, no raised voice, no theatrical cruelty, only certainty. That certainty, more than the words themselves, revealed how completely he believed he was restoring the world to its proper arrangement. Lilian held his gaze. She did not flush. She did not look toward the Dowager Duchess for rescue. "Then I hope a man has read the figures carefully." Peter's mouth flattened. Rufus went still, not offended, not quite. Something in the answer appeared to have struck a surface in him that he had not expected anyone to touch. The Dowager Duchess rose with a soft rustle of silk. "Come, Lilian, if my son has decided that arithmetic changes its nature according to who reads it, we must leave him to discover how numbers behave in masculine company." "Mother." "I said nothing improper, Rufus. You rarely need to." Lilian lowered her eyes only long enough to acknowledge the Duke, with the courtesy his rank required. Then she followed the Dowager Duchess toward the morning room. She could feel Peter watching her leave. That mattered more than Rufus's irritation. Peter Fossett knew she had recognized something inside those figures. He did not yet know how much she knew. She intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. Behind her, Rufus turned back to the report. Fossett, Your Grace, the widow on page 6. What was the date of her relief entry? Peter hesitated. I would need to consult the books. Rufus's eyes moved to the line Lilian had quoted without seeing the page. So would I, he said. By late afternoon, the hall had emptied. The ledgers had been carried away, and the original report remained with Rufus under the estate solicitor's temporary release. In the quiet of the room assigned to her, Lilian opened a small writing case and removed a steel dip pen set into a worn walnut holder. It had belonged to her father. The wood was darkened where years of fingers had rested against it. She placed it beside a sheet of blank paper, then opened the notebook in which she had kept her own totals. 18 pages, 7 widows. 11 discrepancies large enough to matter. 3 weeks of listening to women who had learned to lower their voices when speaking about money. Across the hall, the Duke was reading the report again, still wondering how Miss Tarrant had known a line he had never shown her. He did not yet know that every word he admired on those 18 unsigned pages had been written by her. By breakfast the next morning, Rufus Westerdale had discovered that uncertainty was far more irritating than error. Error could be corrected, a figure could be recalculated, a lease clause reread, an account traced back to the hand that entered it. Uncertainty remained in the room after every sensible explanation had been offered, and Miss Lilian Tarrant had left him with rather too much of it. The breakfast room at Ewbank Hall was quieter than the lower hall had been the previous day. A low fire burned behind the brass fender. Coffee stood beside the Duke's place, tea beside the Dowager Duchess, and a silver dish of eggs had gone nearly untouched because Rufus had spent most of the meal reading the same sheet of paper. The original Blackmere report still remained in his possession under the estate solicitor's temporary release. It lay folded beside his plate, not displayed, but not forgotten. Lilian sat 2 places from the Dowager Duchess with a small folder resting beside her chair. She had spoken little. Rufus had noticed that too. Miss Tarrant. She looked up. Your Grace. Yesterday you referred to one of the Blackmere cases with some precision. The Dowager Duchess lifted her teacup but said nothing. Rufus had the distinct impression his mother had no intention of missing what followed. I referred to a discrepancy. You referred to more than that. He placed one hand over the report without opening it. Suppose I asked about case 4. Lilian's expression did not alter. What about her? The widow received relief in the 2nd week of October. Lilian answered before caution could stop her. The 1st week, silence. The clock on the mantel gave a small mechanical click that seemed suddenly too loud. Lilian lowered her eyes for one heartbeat. When she raised them again, Rufus was watching her with the stillness he usually reserved for men attempting to mislead him. You are certain? He asked. Yes. How? She reached for her tea. I remember dates. So do I. I remember the date printed in the report because I read it 3 times after you left yesterday. His gaze remained on her. You remember a date from a document you claim not to have seen. I did not claim that. No. You were careful not to. The Dowager Duchess set down her cup. Rufus, if you intend to conduct an examination before Marmalade, at least allow Miss Tarrant to finish her tea. I am asking a question. You are circling one. Lilian almost smiled, but not quite. Rufus saw the movement and found it unexpectedly distracting. He turned his attention back to the matter before him. Very well, I will ask it plainly. How did you know that line? Lilian's fingers rested against the rim of her cup. She was not frightened. He had questioned estate men twice her age who had shown more visible discomfort. What she displayed instead was calculation, not the evasive sort Peter Fossett favored, but the careful weighing of what belonged to her to disclose and what did not. Because I have knowledge of the material behind the report. From whom? That is not mine to answer carelessly. You expect me to investigate Blackmere while withholding the source of the accusations? I expect you to distinguish between an accusation and a pattern. And if the pattern depends upon testimony, then the people who gave it should decide whether their names are used. Rufus leaned back slightly. Her answer irritated him because it was reasonable, more than reasonable. It was precisely the sort of answer he would have respected from a man whose judgment he already trusted. The thought arrived unwelcome. You seem very determined to protect this source. Yes, even from me, especially from anyone who could make speaking costly. That landed harder than he expected. Rank had always been treated as a remedy in Rufus's life. A duke's word opened doors, ended arguments, settled disputes, protected dependents, and frightened men who preferred not to be examined. Lilian spoke as though rank itself could be a pressure. He looked toward his mother. The Dowager Duchess was spreading marmalade with infuriating serenity. "Do not look at me," she said. "I believe Miss Tarrant is answering very well." Lilian reached down for the folder beside her chair. "I have notes that concern my own observations, nothing more." As she lifted it, one loose sheet slipped from between the covers. Rufus moved at the same instant she did. The paper turned once in the air, and both reached for its lower edge. His fingers touched hers. It was the lightest contact imaginable, barely more than the brush of skin against skin before both stopped. Lilian looked at him. Rufus had shaken hands with hundreds of men, offered his arm to dozens of women, danced through whole evenings without remembering the pressure of a single gloved hand. This was different only because neither of them had intended it. Her fingertips were cool from the room. There was a faint stain of ink along one finger. His gaze caught on it before he released the paper. Lilian withdrew her hand at once, and he did the same. No one spoke of the contact. The Dowager Duchess, to her credit or her amusement, appeared suddenly absorbed in her toast. Rufus handed the sheet back without reading it. "Your note." "Thank you." She slid it securely into the folder. The distance between them was exactly what it had been before. It did not feel exactly the same. Rufus rose. "I will speak with Mr. Hatherley." Lilian's eyes sharpened. Mr. Hatherley was the estate solicitor. "About the report, about its delivery. Your Grace." There was warning in the two words. Rufus looked at her. "I have not forgotten what you just said." "Then I hope you will not make him break his word." He almost asked whether the solicitor had given his word to her. Instead, he stopped himself. If he asked and she refused, they would merely return to the same question in another shape. "We shall see." Mr. Hatherley arrived at 11 o'clock, carrying the expression of a solicitor who had been interrupted in work. He considered more orderly than aristocratic curiosity. He was shown into Rufus's study, where the Blackmere report lay on the desk. "You received this personally?" Rufus asked. "I did, Your Grace." "From whom?" Hatherley's answer came without hesitation. "I cannot tell you." Rufus looked up. "Cannot. I gave my word that I would not identify the source without permission." "To the source?" "Yes, Your Grace." "And you considered it appropriate to place an anonymous accusation concerning one of my lessees before me?" "I considered the figures specific enough to deserve examination." I also considered the person who brought them sufficiently credible to justify my attention. You know the identity. I do, and whether the author and the person who delivered it are the same. Hatherley paused. That question approaches the promise rather closely. Rufus felt the familiar impulse to end the matter by authority. He could instruct Hatherley. He could remind him whose estate paid his fees. He could demand the name and receive it within minutes, one way or another. Yesterday, he might have done exactly that. Instead, he heard Lilian's voice, especially from anyone who could make speaking costly. His jaw tightened. Very well. Hatherley blinked once. Your Grace, keep your promise. The solicitor inclined his head. Thank you. Do not thank me. I dislike it. I had assumed as much. Rufus gave him a look. Hatherley wisely collected nothing except his hat. When Rufus returned to the morning room, he found Lilian at the window sorting correspondence for the Dowager Duchess. She turned as he entered. He did not approach too closely. Mr. Hatherley refused to identify the source. Good. You sound pleased. I am. I could have compelled the answer. Her gaze held his. But you didn't. No. Something changed in her expression then. Not approval. He would have recognized approval and, irritatingly, wanted it. This was smaller, a fractional easing, as though one expectation she had held concerning him had been revised rather than erased. Rufus looked at the folder in her hands, then at the faint ink mark still visible on her finger. I will not ask Mr. Hatherley again. Lilian waited. I will ask you. The Dowager Duchess remained across the room, near enough for propriety, and far enough to grant them the dignity of speaking, without an audience pretending not to listen. Rufus kept his voice low. Did you write the Blackmere report? Lilian did not answer at once. He saw the moment she made the decision. Her shoulders settled. Her hand closed gently over the folder, not defensively now, but as though accepting the weight of what came next. Then she met his eyes. Yes, Your Grace. I wrote it. For several seconds after Lilian's admission, Rufus said nothing. The morning room seemed to hold its breath around them. The Dowager Duchess had lowered the letter she had been reading, though she made no attempt to intervene. Beyond the windows, a gardener crossed the pale November lawn with a basket hooked over one arm, unaware that 18 unsigned pages had just acquired a name. Rufus looked at Lilian, then at the report in his hand, and something in his expression altered with uncomfortable precision. He had admired the argument. He had praised the discipline. He had assumed the author was a man because the work had seemed too exact, too unsentimental, too assured to fit the category into which he had placed her. The realization did not permit him the refuge of claiming he had misread her. He had read her work correctly. He had misread the woman. You wrote all of it, he asked. Yes. The figures, the comparisons, the conclusions? Yes. And you delivered it to Hatherley? Lilian's gaze remained steady. I did. Rufus turned toward the door. Send for Mr. Hatherley. The footman outside obeyed at once. When the solicitor arrived, a quarter-hour later, he entered carrying no papers, which told Lilian he had understood. The summons was about testimony, rather than documents. Rufus stood beside the writing table. The original Blackmere report remained in his possession, folded once beneath his hand. Mr. Hatherley, he said, did Miss Tarrant personally bring you this report? Hatherley glanced toward Lilian before answering. She gave the smallest nod. Permission. Yes, Your Grace. Did she state that she had written it? She did. And she asked that her name be withheld until she consented to its disclosure. Rufus looked at Lilian again. Why? The question carried less command now. She heard the difference. Because I wanted you to read the evidence before deciding what sort of person could have gathered it. His mouth tightened slightly. You expected prejudice. I expected habit. Mine. Not yours alone. That answer seemed to trouble him more than accusation might have done. Lilian continued before he could retreat into silence. The women at Blackmere have complained before. Their objections were treated as confusion, grief, poor arithmetic, or ingratitude. I wanted the pattern judged before anyone could say it was only another woman misunderstanding an account. Rufus lowered his eyes to the report. His own pencil marks remained beside several passages he had praised the day before. One word was underlined twice, disciplined. He said quietly, I owe you an apology. Lilian did not move. For yesterday, for what I said. Yes, he looked at her directly. I was wrong. The words were simple. They were not easy for him. She could see that, and some kinder part of her recognized the effort. But kindness was not the same as absolution. You were wrong about who wrote the report, she said. I was wrong about more than that, perhaps. Rufus's brow drew slightly. That is not forgiveness. No, nor gratitude. No. What is it then? Lilian folded her hands loosely before her. An apology is a beginning, your grace. It does not change the conditions that made anonymity useful. The Dowager Duchess looked down, but Lilian suspected she was hiding satisfaction. Rufus did not bristle. That mattered, he only asked. What would change them? Listening before, deciding who is qualified to speak. Hatherley's attention drifted with great professionalism toward the mantel. Rufus gave a short breath that was almost humorless. You do not waste words. The report did not either. For the first time, something like reluctant amusement touched his face and vanished. Then the Duke returned to business. Very well. We begin with the figures. He turned to Hatherley. Fossett's renewal is postponed. The solicitor looked up sharply. Pending review, pending review. And I want written instructions sent before noon. No widow connected with Blackmere relief is to lose tied housing, have her allowance altered, or suffer any change in ordinary terms while this inquiry proceeds. Lilian's eyes narrowed. Can you enforce that upon Mr. Fossett? His lease runs through my estate. I can make non-retaliation a condition of my considering renewal. Then put it in writing. Rufus met her gaze. I intended to. Good. Something passed between them then that was not tenderness and not yet trust, but the possibility of trust. It rested upon the fact that he had not asked her to admire the order. He had simply made it. Rufus looked back to the report. Will you investigate the figures with me? Lilian did not answer at once. The question surprised her less than the form of it. Will you? Not you will. She considered him carefully. Under conditions. Name them. No witness is to be pressured into speaking because you are a duke. Agreed. If a woman refuses to have her name used, we do not use it. Agreed. You do not identify me publicly as the author until I consent. Rufus paused. Even if concealment weakens the inquiry, especially then, if the evidence is sound, it should survive without my name long enough to be examined. His expression became thoughtful rather than offended. Agreed. And if I disagree with you, I am permitted to say so without being removed from the work for my own protection. The Dowager Duchess's brows rose. Hatherley became intensely interested in the pattern of the carpet. Rufus held Lilian's gaze for a long moment. You anticipate me badly. I anticipate rank. There is a distinction. I hope to discover one. He almost smiled again. This time the change remained visible for an instant longer. Then we have terms. Hatherley cleared his throat. Your Grace, I should perhaps mention that Mr. Fossett has already sent over the Blackmere account books in anticipation of the renewal discussion. Rufus turned. They are here. In the estate office. Bring the widow relief entries for September and October. Within the hour, the second scene of the day unfolded around a narrower table in Rufus's study. Peter Fossett stood at one end. Lilian sat near the window, with the Dowager Duchess in the adjoining drawing room, the connecting doors left open. Hatherley placed the Blackmere books before the Duke. Rufus did not announce Lilian's authorship. He had given his word. Peter glanced at her once, irritation sharpened by uncertainty. I understand the renewal has been delayed, he said. It has, Rufus replied. On what grounds? I have questions. About anonymous complaints. About your accounts. That distinction cooled the room. Rufus opened the ledger to the first marked entry. Mrs. Hale, relief due, £3. Receipt signed for £3. Peter inclined his head. Correct. Rufus turned another page. Yet the report states she received £1, 11 shillings in cash. Then the report is misleading. Is it? Peter's confidence returned. The receipt is signed. Lilian watched his hand rather than his face. He placed 2 fingers upon the ledger, as though the ink itself were a verdict. Rufus continued. Mrs. Dyer, £2, 10 shillings relief. Receipt signed for the full amount. Yes. Cash recorded elsewhere as £1, 6 shillings. Peter's expression barely changed. Company debts may be settled against benefit where the recipient agrees. And these women agreed? They signed. Rufus looked toward Lilian. He did not ask her to speak. The restraint was deliberate. She understood it as clearly as if he had announced it. Peter followed the glance and frowned. Is Miss Tarrant now part of this examination? Rufus answered before Lilian could. Miss Tarrant is here at my invitation. He said nothing more. No title, no explanation, no public exposure of her authorship. Peter returned his attention to the books. Then I hope she understands that signatures are difficult things to argue with. Lilian finally spoke. Only if you assume a signature tells you why it was given. Peter's eyes hardened. Rufus looked down at the ledger again. There it was, written beside 3 widow entries in the same narrow hand. Account settled against benefit. Not missing money, not yet. Something more careful, something designed to look voluntary. Rufus closed the book. Mr. Fossett, you will provide every relief receipt from the last 6 months. Peter hesitated. All of them? All. When Peter left, Rufus did not immediately speak. Lilian watched the closed door, feeling the shape of the problem change. The mystery was no longer whether the figures were false. The figures agreed too well. The receipts existed. The signatures were genuine. Somewhere between the sum promised and the cash received, consent had been made to look much cleaner on paper than it had felt in life. The first widow would not look at the Duke. She looked instead at Lilian's notebook, at the small blank space beneath her own name, and then at the cottage door as though someone might already be standing outside it. Blackmere lay scarcely 4 miles from Ewbank Hall, but on the morning of the 6th of November, it felt farther from the polished order of the ducal estate than distance could explain. The carriage had taken little more than half an hour over damp roads bordered by bare hedges and dark fields. Rufus had insisted upon daylight, an estate clerk, and Mrs. Bell, an older companion from the Dowager Duchess's household, so that no visit could later be twisted into an improper private expedition. Lilian had approved every precaution. She had also made one condition before they left Ewbank. No woman was to be questioned merely because the Duke had come to her door. Rufus had agreed. Now he stood near the cold fireplace of Mrs. Hale's cottage and discovered what that promise required of him. Mrs. Hale was perhaps 40, though widowhood and hard seasons had drawn years into the skin around her mouth. Her dress was clean, her cuffs carefully mended. A kettle breathed faint steam from the hob. Nothing in the room looked disorderly except the fear in her hands. She had already confirmed that her husband had worked at Blackmere until his death the previous spring. She had confirmed that a widow benefit had been entered for her in October. She had even acknowledged that her signature appeared upon a receipt for £3. Then Lilian had asked how much money she had actually carried home. Mrs. Hale's gaze had dropped, £1.11. Rufus remained silent. Lilian asked, "And the remainder?" "They said it settled what was owing." "Who said that?" The widow's fingers tightened in her apron. "The paymaster." "What was owing?" "Cottage rent, coal. A charge from when Thomas was ill. I don't know all of it." "Were you shown the account?" "Some figures." "Were you told you could receive the whole £3 in cash?" Mrs. Hale looked toward Rufus then, but only for a second. "I was told the account had to be put right." Rufus felt the words settle unpleasantly in the small room. Peter Fossett's defense returned to him. The women signed. Voluntary settlement. Agreement. On paper, those words might look clean. Here they did not. Lilian did not press. "Did you believe you could refuse?" Mrs. Hale's mouth parted, then closed. Her eyes moved again toward the door. That was answer enough for Rufus, but Lilian did not treat it as one. "Mrs. Hale," she said gently, "I can record what you tell me only if you want me to. You may also ask me to close this notebook and never use your words." The widow stared at her. "Would that harm your case?" "It might. And you'd still leave it out?" "Yes." Rufus looked at Lilian. Until that moment, his admiration for her had remained tied to intellect. He had seen the clarity of her report, the economy of her questions, the disciplined manner in which she separated what she knew from what she merely suspected. This was different. She had been publicly dismissed, privately doubted, and forced to conceal her own authorship in order to make men read what she had written. Mrs. Hale's testimony could strengthen everything Lilian had risked, yet she was offering the woman an exit without bargaining for it. Mrs. Hale swallowed. "Then I'd rather you didn't write my words." Lilian closed the notebook at once. No sigh, no disappointment, no appeal to Rufus's authority, just the soft meeting of paper and cover. "Then I won't." Something in Rufus's chest shifted with an unfamiliar discomfort. Not pity, certainly not gratitude. Attraction had no business arriving in a cottage smelling of coal smoke and boiled tea. Yet he recognized it for what it was, precisely because it came without softness. He was drawn to the restraint in her, to the fact that she would rather lose useful evidence than take a frightened woman's choice. Mrs. Hale seemed almost confused by the ease of the refusal. "You won't tell His Grace. You have already spoken in his presence," Lilian said. "But I will not turn what you said into a formal statement unless you ask me to." Rufus finally spoke. "Nor will I." The widow looked at him fully for the first time. He had expected rank to reassure her. Instead, he saw the exact instant she measured what his promise might be worth against the roof above her head. "Mr. Fossett's men collect the cottage accounts," she said. "Yes," Rufus replied, "not mine. But the cottage is on Blackmere ground, under a lease from my estate. So if Mr. Fossett says we owe—" She stopped. Rufus understood. Power blurred at the edges when one man owned the land, another controlled the mine, and a widow depended upon both. "No change will be made to your occupation while this review proceeds," he said. "That order has already been given." Mrs. Hale's expression did not ease. "And after?" Rufus had no honest answer. He could not promise permanent tenancy before he had examined the lease. "After, I will know more than I know today." Lilian glanced at him. It was not praise, but he recognized the absence of false certainty as something she noticed. Mrs. Hale nodded slowly. When they rose to leave, she hesitated beside a narrow shelf near the door. Behind a chipped jug lay a folded piece of printed paper, browned at the edges. She drew it out with care. "This used to be at the pit gate." Lilian stopped. "What is it?" "A notice. They put up a new one after Michaelmas, but I kept this because Thomas had marked the date on the back. I thought perhaps I'd need to remember." Rufus did not move closer. Lilian waited. Mrs. Hale unfolded the paper herself. The print was faded but readable. Beneath rules concerning relief and cottage accounts stood a sentence that caught Lilian's attention immediately. "Continued occupation may be reconsidered where company accounts remain unsettled." She read it twice. "May I look more closely?" "Yes." Mrs. Hale held it out, but Lilian did not take it yet. "Do you want me to use it?" The widow looked from the notice to the closed notebook. Her fear had not vanished, but something else had entered beside it. "Choice. You can use the paper," she said. "Not my words." "I understand." Only then did Lilian accept it, Mrs. Bell witnessed the exchange, and the estate clerk noted that the original notice had been lent voluntarily by Mrs. Hale to Miss Tarrant. Rufus watched the entire transfer. No hidden evidence, no convenient disappearance. A frightened woman had placed one object into Lilian's hands, because Lilian had first proven she could be trusted to leave empty-handed. Their second visit, the following day, produced less, Mrs. Dyer admitted, receiving less cash than the sum on her signed receipt, but would say only that accounts were accounts, and she wished to keep peace. Lilian did not challenge her. Rufus did not ask a single question after the woman declined. On the carriage journey back to Ewbank, Mrs. Bell sat opposite them, with the estate clerk beside her, while Lilian held the folded compensation notice inside a plain document envelope on her lap. Rufus kept his gaze on the passing hedgerows for several minutes before speaking. "You knew, Mrs. Hale's statement would have helped." "Yes, and you let it go. It wasn't mine to take. Even if Fossett uses their silence against you. Especially then." Rufus turned toward her. "You are prepared to lose an argument rather than compel the evidence that might win it." "If compulsion is the method, I have already lost the argument." He looked at her longer than propriety required, though not long enough to invite comment from Mrs. Bell. There was no physical contact between them. None was needed for Lilian to feel that his attention had changed. It was no longer the curiosity of a duke discovering that a woman had surprised him. It had become something quieter and more dangerous. Respect had begun to acquire warmth. Rufus was the first to look away. "Hatherley mentioned my father's Blackmere lease contains appendices concerning the relief fund." Lilian's hand tightened slightly over the envelope. "Have you seen them?" "Not yet." "The original should still be in the Ewbank muniment room. Then, before we decide what these signatures mean, we should know what the lease allowed." Agreed. Carriage rolled beneath the stone arch of Ewbank's entrance court. As afternoon light faded across the wet gravel, inside the envelope on Lilian's lap lay a notice that did not prove a threat had been spoken. It did something more useful. It showed that every widow at Blackmere had reason to understand that unpaid company accounts could endanger the roof over her head. By the 9th of November, the question at Blackmere had become more dangerous because the papers were beginning to agree with the women. That morning, Lilian stood in Mr. Hatherley's office at Ewbank Hall while the estate solicitor unfolded Mrs. Hale's faded compensation notice beneath the window. Mrs. Hale's original still bore the crease made by years in a cottage drawer and the faint pencil date her husband had written on the reverse before his death. Lilian had carried it back from Blackmere in a plain envelope, but she did not intend to keep possession of it longer than necessary. "I want the transfer recorded," she said. Hatherley looked over his spectacles. "You are lending me work before I have asked for it. I am preventing future arguments, a habit I heartily approve." Rufus stood beside the long table, the Blackmere account extracts before him. He had already learned enough about Lilian to know that when she became precise about custody, she had usually imagined the accusation someone else might make later. Hatherley took out his daybook and entered the details carefully. Original printed Blackmere compensation notice. Lent voluntarily by Mrs. Hale to Miss Lilian Tarrant on the 6th of November. Deposited with the Ewbank estate solicitor on the 9th of November for safekeeping and examination. He sanded the ink, then turned the book so Lilian could read the entry. Satisfied? Yes. She slid the notice across the table. "Then it is yours until it is needed." "Mine in custody," Hatherley corrected. "Mrs. Hale's in ownership." Rufus glanced at him. "You two are well matched." "We are both fond of nouns, Your Grace," Lilian said. "They are less slippery than intentions." Rufus almost smiled. The remark might have been aimed at Peter Fossett. It might also have been aimed at him. He had learned not to assume. Hatherley folded the notice inside a protective paper wrapper and placed it in his document case. Only then did Rufus gesture toward a second bundle. The muniment clerk found the Blackmere lease. The original document was older than Rufus by more than a decade. Written on several folded sheets, its endorsements browned at the edges. Hatherley opened the section concerning the Widow Relief Fund and ran a finger down the clauses. "Appendix C," he said. Lilian moved nearer, though she did not touch the lease. Hatherley read aloud. "The Duke funded relief allowance, where granted upon the death of a Blackmere worker, was to be paid for the widow's immediate support, and was not to be diminished by private, company charges, advances, cottage arrears, or other liabilities owed to the lessee, without separate settlement outside the relief payment." Rufus's expression hardened. "That seems plain." "Plain as to what the lessee may not do with the relief," Hatherley said. "Less plain as to what a widow may voluntarily do after receiving it." Lilian nodded. "Peter will say the women authorized the deduction, and the signatures support him." Rufus looked at her, unless the authorization was not truly voluntary. Which brings us back to the notice. Hatherley tapped the document case. The notice establishes pressure. It does not establish what was said to any particular widow. "Nor should we pretend it does," Lilian replied. Rufus watched her for a moment. Each time the evidence could be made stronger by exaggeration, she refused the temptation. It was becoming difficult not to admire that refusal, more difficult still not to admire the woman making it. Hatherley closed the lease and placed it inside a sealed document folder. "I will retain this with the notice. If we need either elsewhere, I will carry them myself." Rufus nodded. "Do that." By noon, the three of them were on the road to Blackmere, accompanied again by an estate clerk and Mrs. Bell. The journey took a little more than half an hour. At the mine office, Peter received them with the politeness of a man who had already decided what defense he would use. Rufus did not show him Appendix C. He asked questions instead. When a widow signs for £3 and receives less in cash, what do you call the difference? Settlement, if she agrees. And where is that agreement recorded? On the receipt or in the company account? Is there a separate document showing she chose to apply relief against debt? Peter's pause was brief. Not always. These are practical people, Your Grace. We cannot surround every shilling with a solicitor, Lilian said, yet you surround every deduction with a signature. Peter turned toward her. By now, he knew she was more than a curious guest, though Rufus had not yet publicly identified her as the report's author, because signatures protect everyone. Do they? They protect the widow from confusion later, and they protect the company from accusations made after memory has softened. Rufus's gaze sharpened. You speak as though complaints are inevitable. Grief makes money personal. Lilian held his eyes. Money is usually personal to the person who needs it. Peter's smile thinned. I am sure Miss Tarrant has strong feelings on the matter. Rufus did not intervene. Lilian did not require rescuing from a sentence. She required space to answer it. Feelings are not the issue, she said. The issue is whether a payment marked as relief remained relief after it passed through your books. Peter's expression changed, only slightly. It was enough. You have seen the lease, he said. Rufus gave no answer. Peter's jaw see. Then, silence confirmed more than words would have. If the women agreed to set off their debts, Peter continued, the clause is irrelevant. That is what you intend to argue, Rufus asked. It is not an argument. It is fact. Then you should have no objection to our examining whether they had a genuine choice. Peter looked toward Lilian again. And who decides what counts as genuine? Not you, she said. Not me. We look at what existed around the signature. Peter's control slipped for the first time. You are treating ordinary mine accounts as though every widow were incapable of understanding them. Lilian's voice remained calm. No, I am treating them as women who understood exactly what could happen if they displeased the man controlling their wages, debts, and cottages. The estate clerk went very still. Rufus saw Peter's eyes flick toward him. That reaction mattered. So did the fact that Peter had not denied the relationship between debt and housing. The meeting ended shortly afterward, not because the issue was settled, but because Rufus had learned what he needed. Outside, the yard was damp from a morning shower. Coal dust darkened the ruts, and the path from the office to the waiting carriage crossed a strip of wet slag made slick beneath their shoes. Mrs. Bell had already taken the clerk's arm. Lilian stepped carefully, gathering the front of her skirt just enough to keep the hem clear. Rufus moved beside her, then stopped himself before reaching for her. He offered his forearm instead. May I? Lilian looked at him. The question was ordinary. The fact that he had asked made it something else. She placed her gloved hand upon his sleeve. Yes, his arm was steady beneath her hand. They crossed the uneven ground without hurry. No one watching could have called the gesture improper. A gentleman offered support. A lady accepted it. Yet Lilian was acutely aware that Rufus did not tighten his arm around hers or guide her by force. He let her choose each step. At the end of the slag path, where the ground became firm, neither of them released the contact immediately. It lasted only a heartbeat longer than necessity. Lilian was the one who withdrew. Rufus's eyes met hers, and for one quiet instant the investigation, Peter Fossett, and the cold November yard seemed to move to the edge of the world. Then a carriage door opened behind them. "Your Grace." The voice was feminine, polished, and unmistakably aristocratic. Lady Ethel Bassett had arrived at Blackmere in a dark green carriage bearing her father's crest. She was visiting Ewbank for several days with her aunt, and had apparently chosen to join the Dowager Duchess's afternoon excursion later than expected. Her gaze moved from Rufus to Lilian, then to the damp path behind them. She smiled perfectly. "I hope I am not interrupting estate business." "You are not," Rufus said. Lady Ethel's attention lingered 1 second too long on Lilian's hand, now resting at her side. "How industrious Miss Tarrant has become." Lilian met the smile with one of her own. The figures insisted. Peter emerged from the office behind them. He saw Lady Ethel. More importantly, he saw where she was looking. By the time the carriages returned to Ewbank, Hatherley's possession of Appendix C was no longer the only fact Peter intended to use. That evening, in a drawing room full of polite conversation, he found an opportunity to stand beside Lady Ethel and say softly, "Miss Tarrant has developed an unusual talent for making grief look very much like influence." By the 11th of November, Rufus had learned that a man could spend years repairing a family name without once asking whether the repair itself had become a kind of vanity. The realization came to him not in the estate office, where the Blackmere accounts had been arranged in orderly columns, but on a cold path behind Ewbank Hall, where the last copper leaves clung to the beech trees, and Lilian Tarrant walked beside him, with her hands tucked into a dark muff. The Dowager Duchess and Mrs. Bell followed at a respectable distance, close enough for propriety, and far enough to grant conversation without making it performance. Hatherley remained indoors with the original anonymous report, Mrs. Hale's compensation notice, and Appendix C of the Blackmere lease secured in his custody. Nothing further could be learned from those papers that morning. What troubled Rufus was what the papers had already revealed. "My father believed a lease was honest if every clause could be defended," he said. Lilian turned her head slightly. "Was it?" "Usually. That wasn't my question." He gave her a look that might once have been irritation. Now it was almost recognition. "No, it wasn't always honest." They continued along the gravel path. The eastern lawn fell away toward bare fields silvered by an overnight frost. Blackmere lay beyond them, unseen but no longer abstract. For most of Rufus's life, the mine had existed in account books, rent schedules, reports, and quarterly summaries. He had visited it, certainly. He had spoken to foremen and tenants. He had approved repairs. Yet there was a difference between knowing that cottages belonged to a lease and understanding what that meant to a widow who feared the loss of one. "There were complaints during my father's last years," he said, "not only about Blackmere, other estate arrangements as well. Harsh renewals. Men who knew how far they could press a clause without technically breaking it. My father dismissed most criticism as sentimental interference." Lilian listened without interrupting. "When he died, I inherited more than land. I inherited the belief that House Westerstale profited because it could afford not to hear what poorer people were saying." His jaw tightened. Some of that was unfair, and some was not. The admission left a bitterness in his mouth he had not expected. He had spent years answering that inherited accusation with diligence. Better leases, cleaner accounts, fewer delegated decisions, no tolerance for corruption that could be proved. Society had praised him for it. Men who had once called his father ruthless now called Rufus conscientious. He had accepted the distinction with more satisfaction than he liked to remember, Lilian asked. Is that why Blackmere matters so much to you? The women matter. I didn't say they didn't. Rufus stopped near a stone bench sheltered by yew hedges. The Dowager Duchess, some distance behind, had paused to examine late chrysanthemums with Mrs. Bell. Rufus knew his mother well enough to understand that she could remain interested in one damaged flower for as long as discretion required. I have spent years trying to make certain no one can say I am my father, he said. Lilian stood opposite him, her expression thoughtful rather than indulgent. He wished suddenly that she would offer him an easy sentence. She did not. I do not know when duty became indistinguishable from proving I am not him. The words felt more exposed than any confession he had made in a drawing room, because they gave Lilian something rank could not protect. She could think less of him. Worse, she could think him performative. The possibility mattered. That fact unsettled him almost as much as the confession itself. Lilian looked toward the distant fields. Then you should be careful. Of what? Of needing this inquiry to redeem you. Rufus's expression tightened. You think that is what I am doing? I think it could become what you are doing. There is a difference. There is always a difference at first. Her answer was quiet. That made it harder to dismiss. If you need Blackmere to prove you're unlike your father, then Peter Fossett stops being a man whose conduct must be examined and becomes an opportunity. The widows become evidence of your virtue. I become useful to your reputation. Rufus stared at her. She had found the point he had not yet been willing to name. You assume the worst of my motives. No, Lilian met his eyes. I assume motives can change while we're looking at something else. He looked away first. A rook called somewhere beyond the trees. Gravel shifted beneath the Dowager Duchess's shoes in the distance, then stilled again. What would you have me do? He asked. Let the truth cost your name something. Rufus looked back. Meaning? If the inquiry shows that House Westerdale failed to notice what was done under its lease, say so. If your protection came too late, admit it. If the arrangements were technically lawful in places and still cruel in practice, do not hide behind the distinction because it embarrasses you. He almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. You make public humiliation sound medicinal. Only when deserved. And if I do all of that, will you believe I am different from him? The questioners escaped before he could stop it. Lilian's expression softened, but she did not give him the absolution he had unconsciously requested. I don't think your father should be the measure of you. Rufus felt the answer with unexpected force. That is inconveniently sensible. You may ignore it. I have done poorly when ignoring you. A faint warmth touched her face, not quite a blush, and the sight of it altered the air between them. Neither moved closer. Neither needed to. The distance itself had become charged with awareness. Rufus had admired her judgment before. Now he understood that he wanted her judgment of him, which was a far more dangerous thing. He sat on the stone bench, leaving ample space beside him. Lilian hesitated, then sat at the other end, her posture composed. For several moments they said nothing. The silence did not feel empty. There is another part I dislike admitting, Rufus said, which is, I should have known more. Lilian waited. Blackmere is on my land. Fossett holds the lease from my estate. I read the summaries. I approved the renewal discussions. If he used those arrangements to make refusal costly, I may not have ordered it, but I allowed my son to remain far enough away not to see it. Negligence is not the same as intention. It is not innocence either. Her gaze settled on him. No, He appreciated that she did not comfort him. Strange as it was, her refusal made the moment safer. She would not lie to protect his pride. He could say more because she would not reward the saying merely for being difficult. "I am afraid of what else I may have missed," he admitted, "not only at Blackmere." The confession lowered something between them. Lilian removed one hand from her muff and rested it on the bench between them, palm upward. Rufus looked at it. He did not move. He had offered his arm at Blackmere and waited for her acceptance. Now she was the one offering something, and he understood that reaching too quickly would change its meaning. Lilian met his eyes. Then she gave a small nod. Only then did Rufus place his hand in hers. Her fingers closed around his with deliberate gentleness. His hand was larger, warmer, but he did not enclose hers as though claiming it. They simply held on. The gesture lasted beyond courtesy, beyond accident, beyond any plausible need for balance. Lilian felt the steadiness of his breathing change once. Rufus looked down at their joined hands, then back at her. "You make it very difficult to pretend I am certain." "Good." The corner of his mouth moved. "You are merciless." "Not at all. I'm holding your hand." That surprised a real laugh from him, low and brief. Lilian's fingers tightened once in response. Neither released immediately. The warmth between their palms carried no promise they had earned yet. It carried only recognition. He had trusted her with fear. She had answered not with pity, but with presence. The Dowager Duchess began walking again in the distance, signaling that discretion had nearly reached its proper limit. Lilian slowly withdrew her hand. Rufus allowed it without resistance. The loss of contact was sharper than he expected. "We should go back," she said. "Yes." Before either could rise, a footman appeared at the end of the path, approaching with the careful urgency of someone bearing unwelcome news. He stopped several yards away and bowed. "Your Grace, Miss Tarrant. A message has come from Blackmere." Rufus stood. "From whom?" Mrs. Hale's boy brought it to the service entrance. "Mrs. Hale asks that Miss Tarrant not use anything she said. She says she can no longer support the account she gave." Lilian went very still. Rufus's first instinct was anger. His second was to send a man to Blackmere immediately. Then he remembered what she had asked of him. No contact with witnesses through rank or pressure. He looked at Lilian instead. "What do you want done?" Her eyes remained on the footman. "Nothing yet." Rufus nodded. He did not order pursuit. He did not ask why. But as they turned toward Ewbank Hall, both understood the same thing. Peter Fossett had begun visiting the women whose silence protected him. By the 14th of November, Lilian had learned that frightened people could tell the truth in private and deny it in public without either moment being entirely false. The luncheon at Ewbank Hall had been arranged after the November estate accounts review, with several principal tenants, neighbouring landowners, estate officers, and Blackmere families invited under the respectable excuse of discussing the mine lease before its renewal. By then Lilian had consented to her authorship becoming known. There was no longer any useful protection in anonymity once Peter Fossett had begun visiting the widows himself, and she would not allow uncertainty about the report's source to become another weapon against the women whose figures she had recorded. Rufus had respected the condition she set. He had told no one until that morning. Now the knowledge moved through the room faster than any formal announcement could have done. Miss Tarrant had written the Blackmere report. Miss Tarrant had interviewed widows. Miss Tarrant had examined relief payments. Miss Tarrant, an unmarried gentlewoman with no official position at the mine, had placed a commercial lessee's conduct before a duke. Lilian could almost feel each fact being fitted into a version of her character by people who had never asked what she intended. She sat halfway down the long table near the Dowager Duchess and Mrs. Bell. Rufus occupied the head, outwardly composed, though Lilian had begun to recognize the signs of anger beneath his restraint. His right hand remained flat beside his plate. His shoulders had gone very still. Peter Fossett sat opposite Hatherley with 3 copied account summaries before him and the confidence of a man who had prepared for exactly this room. Lady Ethel Bassett had been placed near the Dowager Duchess, where she could appear socially detached from estate business while hearing every word. Peter waited until the first course had been removed before speaking. Your Grace, since my renewal has been delayed on the strength of Miss Tarrant's report, I should be grateful for the opportunity to correct one unfortunate impression. Rufus looked toward him. Which impression? That Blackmere withheld relief improperly. Peter produced 3 receipts from his company file. Not the widow's originals. Those remained with the women themselves. These were company counterparts recording the same signed acknowledgements. Mrs. Hale, £3, signed Mrs. Dyer, £2, 10 shillings, signed Mrs. Pritchard, £2, signed. The third name belonged to a woman Lilian had interviewed in September before the report had been given to Hatherley. Mrs. Pritchard sat near the lower end of the table, rigid in a brown dress, polished with long wear. Lilian had not spoken to her since Peter began visiting the cottages. Peter placed one finger upon the papers. The report suggests these women did not receive what was awarded to them, yet each acknowledged the full sum. Lilian said, the report states how much was entered as relief and how much was received in cash. It does not claim the signatures are false. Then perhaps the report simply mistakes settlement for deprivation. His tone was mild. That was the danger of him. He could make an accusation sound like a correction offered for everyone's comfort. The women had outstanding accounts. They agreed to settle them. There is nothing mysterious in that. Rufus spoke before Lilian did. There is if the relief was protected from those deductions under the lease. Peter inclined his head. Unless the recipient chose the settlement herself, did she? We have signatures. Lilian felt the room lean toward that word. Signatures. Ink was reassuring to people who preferred paper to fear. Peter turned toward the lower table. Mrs. Hale, perhaps you could spare Miss Tarrant further anxiety. When we spoke this week, did you not say you may have misunderstood how your account was explained? Mrs. Hale's face lost what little color it had. Lilian did not look at Rufus. She looked only at the widow. You do not have to answer. Peter spread his hands. There. That is precisely the difficulty. Miss Tarrant invites statements, then discourages clarification when the clarification does not support her conclusions. Rufus's chair shifted a fraction. Lilian knew without seeing him that anger had risen. She also knew anger from a duke could become its own pressure. Mrs. Hale, she said, keeping her voice steady. You may say whatever you choose. The widow swallowed. Her gaze moved toward Peter, then toward the windows, as though Blackmere cottages might somehow be visible beyond the lawns. I may have misunderstood, she whispered. The words struck Lilian more painfully because she had expected them. Peter turned immediately to Mrs. Dyer. And you? Mrs. Dyer twisted a handkerchief in her lap. Accounts are difficult, mister. Fossett's people said things were properly done. I don't wish to accuse anyone. Did Miss Tarrant perhaps take your concern more seriously than you intended? Mrs. Dyer's eyes filled with shame. Perhaps. Mrs. Pritchard spoke before Peter asked her. I don't want trouble. I told Miss Tarrant things when I was upset. I may have made them sound worse. 3 women, 3 retreats. The room changed around Lilian. She heard no open laughter, no crude accusation, only the rustle of respectable doubt. That was enough. A neighboring landowner glanced toward his wife. One estate officer looked down at his plate. Peter did not need to call Lilian dishonest. He had given everyone permission to wonder whether she had turned grief into evidence because she wanted the importance of being believed by a duke. Lady Ethel lifted her glass, but did not drink. May I ask something that has nothing to do with arithmetic? Rufus's gaze moved to her. You may ask. Miss Tarrant may decline to answer. Ethel smiled faintly. Of course, I merely wonder whether an unmarried gentlewoman entering miners' cottages to collect private grief is entirely wise. Good intentions can become intimacy with matters that do not properly belong to us. Lilian felt the humiliation sharpen, not because Ethel had called her improper outright, but because she had left the word suspended where everyone could complete it privately. Rufus's voice cooled. Lady Ethel. Lilian raised one hand slightly, not to silence him as a duke, to ask him this once to let her answer for herself. He stopped. That mattered. Lilian turned first to Mrs. Hale, then Mrs. Dyer, then Mrs. Pritchard. I will not repeat anything you told me in confidence. Mrs. Hale looked up, startled. Peter frowned. Lilian continued. If you do not wish to speak, your silence belongs to you. I will not purchase my reputation with yours. The words moved through the table differently from Peter's receipts. No one relaxed. No one quite knew what to do with a woman who had just refused the easiest defense available to her. Lady Ethel's brows lifted. But surely, Miss Tarrant, if they now say they were mistaken, then they may say so. And you will not correct them, not by exposing words they no longer consent to have used. Peter gave a quiet, incredulous laugh. Then what remains of your report? The figures, which the signed receipts explain. They explain that signatures exist. Lilian looked at him directly. They do not explain the cost of refusing to sign. A silence followed. Peter's expression stayed composed, but his eyes hardened. Rufus saw it. So did Lilian. The compensation notice remained secured with Hatherley. Appendix C remained secured with Hatherley. Neither needed to be brandished across luncheon plates like a theatrical prop. Their value would come later. For now, the room had seen something more important. 3 frightened women had withdrawn, and Lilian had chosen not to drag them back by the wrist of their own private words. Rufus's anger had not lessened. It had become quieter. Lilian knew enough of him now to find that more worrying. Peter resumed his seat with the confidence of a man who believed he had shifted the balance. Lady Ethel murmured something to the woman beside her. The Dowager Duchess reached for her water with perfect calm. Then Rufus rose. Every conversation stopped. Lilian looked at him and felt unease move through her before he spoke. She had seen what happened when his sense of responsibility outran his willingness to ask. His gaze met hers only briefly. There was protectiveness there. There was anger. There was also decision, since Miss Tarrant's position has now been made a matter of public doubt, he said. I have decided what authority she will have in the Blackmere Review. Rufus did not hesitate. That was the first sign Lilian feared what he was about to do. He stood at the head of the luncheon table with every eye upon him, anger disciplined into something colder than anger, and said, Miss Tarrant will conduct the formal Ashminster review of Blackmere with my full authority. The room went silent. For half a heartbeat, Lilian felt the force of what he intended. He meant to protect her from dismissal. He meant to place rank around the work society had treated as presumptuous because it came from an unmarried woman. He meant to ensure that no clerk, tenant, lessee, or neighboring gentleman could refuse her a ledger or laugh away her questions. He believed he was restoring what had been taken from her. Then Peter Fossett leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was not a broad smile. It was worse. It was the expression of a man who had just been handed the argument he needed. "Your Grace," he said carefully. "Then perhaps I misunderstood the nature of the report." Rufus's gaze hardened. "Explain yourself." Peter folded his hands. "Until this moment, I believed Miss Tarrant presented herself as an independent observer who happened to notice irregularities at Blackmere. But if she now acts with ducal authority, one must naturally ask whether the report was ever independent at all." Lilian felt the words settle through the room. Rufus answered at once. "The report predates this appointment. I do not question the date." Peter's tone remained painfully reasonable. "I question perception. Miss Tarrant writes a report damaging to a lessee whose renewal is under consideration. His Grace then places the author in formal charge of the investigation. If that investigation improves the reputation of House Westerstale, surely people may wonder whether the relationship between the report and the estate is quite as detached as it first appeared." Lady Ethel did not speak, but Lilian saw the slight lift of her chin. Across the table, one landowner shifted in his chair. Another glanced toward Hatherley. The solicitor's expression revealed nothing, which itself was a warning. Rufus said, "Miss Tarrant has received no payment from me for the report." "Not yet," Peter replied. "But she now receives authority no woman in her position would ordinarily possess." The insult was hidden inside social fact. Lilian heard several people hear it. Worse, she heard the new story forming. She was no longer the independent author whose evidence had forced a duke to look again. She was the duke's chosen investigator. His instrument, his answer to embarrassment. Rufus looked toward her then, perhaps expecting gratitude, perhaps expecting relief, perhaps only realizing too late that she had not consented. Lilian kept her face composed until the luncheon ended. She would not give Peter the satisfaction of watching a private wound become public spectacle. She answered no further questions. Rufus did not touch her arm, did not summon her aside, did not attempt to correct the damage with another declaration. To wait until the last guest had left the dining room. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Lilian entered the smaller drawing room overlooking the west lawn. The Dowager Duchess had withdrawn to receive a caller, and Mrs. Bell remained in the adjoining room with the doors open. Rufus stood near the fireplace, one hand braced against the mantel. He turned as Lilian entered. "You are angry." "Yes. I expected you might be." "Then why'd you do it?" The question was quiet, which made it more difficult to answer. Rufus left the mantel but did not approach too closely. "Because Fossett used uncertainty about your position to discredit you, so you decided my position for me. I gave you authority. You gave me your authority, because no one can dismiss it." Lilian looked at him steadily. "That is exactly the problem." Rufus's expression tightened. "I do not understand." "You saw people doubt me, and you decided the answer was to place your name around mine. I meant to prevent them from reducing you to gossip, and instead you made every question I ask look like your question. Every conclusion I reach looks like your conclusion. Every person who disagrees with me can now say, I am only the Duke's appointed woman, carrying out the Duke's reform. The report existed before the appointment. Peter has already made that irrelevant. Rufus was silent. Lilian continued before anger could make her careless. You did not silence me. You did something cleverer. You placed your name around mine until no one could see where mine ended. The words struck him visibly. His shoulders eased, not in relief, but in recognition. He looked away for a moment. I thought I was giving you what society would not. Power, standing. I did not ask for yours. No. The answer came too quickly to be defensive. Rufus looked back at her. You did not. Lilian felt some of her anger shift, not disappear. His willingness to admit the mistake mattered. It did not erase the mistake. I refuse the appointment. Lilian. Miss Tarrant, for the moment. He stopped. Pain crossed his face so briefly she might have imagined it. Very well, Miss Tarrant. I refuse the appointment. I refuse any stipend connected with it. If I continue as the independent author of my own report. Fossett will say that is merely a performance after today. Then let him. You would rather lose protection than risk appearing protected. No, I would rather lose an advantage than become evidence of your virtue. Rufus went very still. She had touched the wound he had confessed 3 days earlier. He did not flinch away from it. You think that is what I made you? Today? Yes. The room held only the small sounds of the fire and distant movement from the adjoining chamber. Rufus did not argue. Lilian watched the struggle in him as clearly as she had watched it beside the beech trees. He wanted to act. He wanted to repair action with more action. For a man accustomed to authority, stillness cost him something. What do you want from me now? He asked. Nothing public, nothing. Not on my behalf. He absorbed that. And Blackmere, continue. Without ducal authority. Yes. Fossett controls access to some company records. Then I use what can be obtained lawfully through Hatherley, estate records, and whatever the women choose to give. Rufus took a breath. You will have access to every document belonging to my estate that you request. Lilian's eyes narrowed. Because I ask for it, not because you have appointed me, because you ask for it. And you will not contact Mrs. Hale, Mrs. Dyer, Mrs. Pritchard, or any other widow on my behalf. Rufus's jaw tightened. Fossett has already been approaching them. I know. He is using fear. Then we do not answer fear with a duke arriving at their door. I could reassure them, or make them feel they have exchanged one powerful man's expectation for another. The truth of it angered him because it was true. She saw that too. You want me to do nothing. I want you to do what you promised. Let them choose. Rufus looked toward the window. Outside, the November afternoon had already begun to darken. I dislike this. I know. I dislike knowing Fossett may be influencing them while I stand aside. Standing aside is not the same as abandoning them. The order against retaliation still stands. Yes, then keep it standing. He nodded slowly. I will. Lilian studied him. She wanted to trust the answer. That desire itself frightened her more than his mistake had. 3 days earlier, she had held his hand while he admitted fear. Today, she kept both of hers folded before her and felt the distance between them like a physical thing. No touch would repair this. No tenderness should. If he meant what he had said about becoming different, he would have to prove it when restraint hurt. Rufus broke the silence first. I will withdraw the appointment, publicly. His eyes returned to hers. Yes, and make clear the report predates any commission from you. Yes, without praising me as compensation. That almost drew a grim smile. You leave a man very little room for eloquence. Good. Rufus gave a short breath. Then I will be plain. Lilian moved toward the door. He did not stop her. He did not reach for her sleeve, did not lower his voice into apology designed to keep her in the room. That restraint was the first useful thing he had done since luncheon. At the threshold, she paused. There is one more matter. What is it? I need Appendix C. Hatherley has it. I know. Tomorrow I want the exact wording copied for my working notes. Nothing else. Rufus nodded. You shall have it, because I asked, because you asked. Lilian left him there. The next stage of the inquiry would have to be built without frightened testimony, without borrowed rank, and without allowing Peter Fossett to define either her motives or her name. If the women could be pressured into silence, then she would find evidence that could not be frightened. On the morning of the 16th of November, Lilian began again, without asking a single widow to repeat herself. Mr. Hatherley received her in his office at Ewbank Hall, with the original Blackmere report locked in his document case. Mrs. Hale's compensation notice folded inside its protective wrapper, and Appendix C of the mineral lease sealed in the folder where he had placed it after the 9th. Nothing had moved without record. Nothing needed to. Lilian wanted access, not possession. The exact wording, she said, taking a seat at the side table. Nothing summarized. Hatherley opened the lease in her presence and turned to the clause. He kept one hand near the document while Lilian copied it into her working notes. The Duke funded widow. Allowance was to be paid for immediate support and was not to be diminished by private company charges, advances, cottage arrears, or liabilities owed to the lessee without separate settlement, outside the relief payment. Lilian read her copy back aloud. Hatherley compared it with the original. Exact. He then opened the wrapper containing the compensation notice. Lilian copied the sentence that mattered most. Continued occupation may be reconsidered where company accounts remain unsettled. When she finished, Hatherley closed the wrapper again and returned both items to his custody. Rufus entered only after the originals were secured. That, Lilian suspected, was deliberate. He carried no papers. He made no suggestion. You asked for access, he said. You have it. Thank you. Is there anything else? She looked at him carefully. 4 days earlier, he would have told her what else she ought to need. Now, he waited. The dates on which Blackmere usually pays widow relief. Those are in the estate summaries. May I see them? Yes, and the general pay days for Blackmere workers. Nothing private, only the dates. Rufus inclined his head. Hatherley will arrange it. No question about what she planned to prove. No offer to send an estate man to Blackmere. No insistence that he sit beside her while she worked. He left the office after less than 3 minutes. Lilian watched the door close behind him. The restraint was not dramatic enough to impress anyone else. That was precisely why she noticed it. During the next 3 days, she reduced the problem to what could be shown without requiring anyone's courage. Her own report contained the totals she had already gathered before the 1st of November. The Blackmere Company counterparts displayed at the luncheon had shown 3 recurring kinds of entry. One recorded the widow benefit in full. Another recorded a smaller amount as cash delivered. A third transferred the difference into company accounts under words such as cottage arrears, coal, advances, or settlement. The figures were not hidden. Their meaning had been. Lilian placed the dates beside one another. Relief was entered on the same days the mine processed ordinary payments. The deduction followed immediately. The widow never appeared in the books as receiving the full benefit and then independently returning part of it days later. The whole sum moved through the account in one operation. £3 granted, £1 and 11 shillings handed over, the remainder absorbed at once. £2, 10 shillings granted, £1, 6 shillings in cash, the rest settled before the widow ever left the pay office. That did not by itself prove a spoken threat. Lilian refused to pretend it did. What it proved was that Peter's description of 2 separate voluntary acts did not fit the sequence on paper. The benefit and the debt settlement were processed together. Then there was the notice. Continued occupation may be reconsidered where company accounts remain unsettled. The sentence did not say a widow would certainly lose her cottage. It did not need to. A woman whose home stood on Blackmere ground and whose dead husband's account remained open could read it perfectly well. Refusal carried a possible price visible before anyone said a word. By the 18th, Lilian had built a table of dates and amounts so simple that even Peter could not bury it beneath mine terminology. She showed it first to Hatherley. He read the page twice. You are saying the signatures may be genuine and still fail to prove free choice. I am saying more narrowly that the signatures prove acknowledgement of the full figure, not the circumstances under which the set-off was accepted. And the notice supplies the pressure surrounding the choice. It supplies a standing consequence. If a widow believed unsettled company accounts could affect her cottage, then clearing those accounts was not an abstract preference. Hatherley tapped one line. Fossett will say no woman was actually evicted for refusing. Then he may say it. You are not going to answer by calling Mrs. Hale. No. Mrs. Dyer. No. Mrs. Pritchard. Lilian closed her pencil between 2 fingers. No. Hatherley studied her. That leaves him room. It leaves them room. The solicitor's expression softened. You understand that the difference may cost you the argument. Yes, and possibly your reputation. That has already been priced. She returned to her figures. At noon, a message came from Blackmere through the estate office. Peter Fossett had requested that the lease renewal be brought forward before the next quarterly benefit payment, arguing that uncertainty was damaging company credit and alarming suppliers. Rufus sent the request to Lilian without comment. No instruction, no suggestion that she hurry. At the bottom of Hatherley's forwarding note, the Duke had written only one sentence. The renewal remains postponed under my existing order. Lilian read it twice. He had not used the pressure of Peter's request to reclaim control of the inquiry. He had simply kept standing where she had asked him to stand. Late on the 19th, when the November light was already fading, and Lilian had nearly finished copying her final comparison, Mrs. Bell entered the morning room. There is a woman below asking for you. Lilian set down her pencil. Who? Mrs. Bell hesitated. Mrs. Hale. Lilian rose immediately, then stopped herself. Did anyone send for her? No. Did His Grace know she was coming? Not until the lodge porter sent word. He gave orders that she be shown in if she wished it, and that no one question her on the way. Lilian's chest tightened at the quiet precision of that. Where is she? The small parlour near the servants' hall. She asked not to go upstairs. Mrs. Hale stood when Lilian entered. Her hands were clasped tightly at her waist, but she looked less frightened than she had in the cottage, more decided. Lilian closed the door only far enough for privacy while leaving Mrs. Bell visible in the corridor beyond. Mrs. Hale, you did not have to come. I know. No one has asked you to change what you said at luncheon. I know that too. Lilian waited. The widow looked down at her hands. Mr. Fossett came to the cottages after you left us before. He said people who caused trouble should not expect favors when accounts were reviewed. He didn't say I'd lose my home. Not exactly. Lilian did not reach for her notebook. You asked me not to use your words. I did. That still stands unless you tell me otherwise, Mrs. Hale looked up. That's why I came. Lilian said nothing. At the luncheon, you could have repeated everything I'd told you. You could have made me look foolish when I said I'd misunderstood. Shame crossed the woman's face. You didn't. You were afraid. I still am. Then you owe me nothing. Mrs. Hale's eyes brightened, but her voice remained steady. I don't want to owe you. I want to speak because I choose to. The words seemed to settle through Lilian with more force than any signature. Are you certain? No. A small, rueful breath escaped the widow. But I've decided. Lilian moved toward the chair opposite her and sat, leaving the table between them. She did not open a notebook. Tell me what you want done. When the next benefits are paid, if Mr. Fossett says we chose it freely, I'll say what happened to me. Publicly. Mrs. Hale swallowed. If I lose my nerve, I want the right to leave. You have it. And I'll bring my original receipt myself. I don't want it taken from me before then. Keep it. Mrs. Hale nodded, relief mingling with fear. Mrs. Dyer and Mrs. Pritchard know I came. Lilian's pulse quickened despite herself. Did they send messages? No. Then I will not ask, Mrs. Hale gave her the first genuine smile Lilian had seen from her. I thought you'd say that. After the widow left, Lilian remained alone for a moment. She could have sent immediately for the other two women. She could have used Mrs. Hale's decision as leverage. She did neither. Across Eubank Hall, Rufus received word only that Mrs. Hale had visited voluntarily and departed safely. He did not come to Lilian's door. He did not ask what had been said. By evening, Lilian understood that trust sometimes returned not through apology or touch, but through the absence of an intrusion one had learned to expect. One widow had chosen to speak. The other two still had their silence, their receipts, and 3 days in which to decide what those things were worth. By the afternoon of the 20th of November, Rufus had done something Lilian had not expected from him. He had corrected himself in public before asking her to forgive him in private, at luncheon with the Dowager Duchess. Hatherley, several estate officers, and 2 neighbouring gentlemen present, he had risen only long enough to make a plain statement. Miss Tarrant held no ducal appointment. She had never received payment, commission, instruction, or promise of reward for the Blackmere report. The report had been delivered independently before he knew its author. Any suggestion that her conclusions had been written to serve House Westerdale was false. Then he sat down. He did not praise her intelligence. He did not describe her courage. He did not turn the correction into another performance of generosity. Lilian understood the restraint immediately. So did Peter Fossett, if the message sent to Blackmere afterward was any indication. By 4 o'clock, Hatherley had received word that Fossett wished to know whether the Duke intended to disavow all involvement in the inquiry. Rufus had answered only that the lease renewal remained postponed and the review of estate obligations would continue. He did not mention Lilian at all that evening as pale light faded over Eubank's west lawn. Lilian found him waiting in the smaller drawing-room where they had argued 5 days before. Mrs. Bell sat in the adjoining chamber with embroidery on her lap, the connecting doors open. Rufus stood when Lilian entered. He looked tired, not theatrically weary, simply like a man who had spent a day choosing not to defend himself. Thank you for the statement at luncheon. Lilian said. It was necessary. Yes, he did not claim credit for necessity. That too was new. Lilian remained near the window. You asked for a conversation. I did. Rufus did not move toward her. I owe you an apology that is more exact than the one I gave before. She waited. His hands were at his sides, empty. No papers, no strategy between them. I made your work proof that I was a better duke, he said. I told myself I was honoring you. I was using you. The words landed differently because he did not soften them. Lilian felt the memory of the luncheon return, the room watching. Peter's expression sharpening the instant. Rufus announced her authority, the sickening realization that her independence had been wrapped in another person's name. Yes, she said. Rufus accepted the answer. I saw people doubting you and thought the quickest way to stop them was to attach my power to you. I did not ask whether you wanted it. I did not ask what it would cost your credibility. Worse, I had already told you I understood the danger of making Blackmere serve my reputation. His jaw tightened. Then I did exactly that. Lilian looked at him carefully. Why? He gave a humorless breath. Because understanding a fault is easier than resisting it when fear arrives. What were you afraid of? That Fossett would destroy your reputation while I stood, by doing nothing. And you still think restraint is doing nothing. Less than I did. Rufus looked toward the dying light beyond the windows. I also feared that if the inquiry failed, it would prove I had missed too much at Blackmere, that I had become the sort of landowner who congratulates himself on clean books while other people pay for what the books conceal. He turned back to her, and when they attacked you, I used the one thing I know how to use without hesitation, rank against my wishes. Yes, you understand that an apology does not make me trust you again. Yes, the answer came without injury, without bargaining. Lilian's shoulders eased slightly. Rufus continued. I have withdrawn the appointment publicly. Hatherley has also prepared a written statement confirming that your report predates any commission, payment, or promise from me. It will remain with the estate papers in case Fossett attempts to suggest otherwise later. I would like to read it before it is filed. Of course. And change wording if it makes me sound employed, by you in some indirect fashion. Of course. Lilian studied him. You are agreeing very quickly. I am practicing. Despite herself, the corner of her mouth moved. Rufus saw it and did not exploit the moment. What do you need from me now? He asked. There it was again. Not what should be done. Not what he had decided. What do you need? Lilian walked toward the writing table, but did not sit. 5 things. Tell me. No pressure on witnesses. Not from you, not from your steward, not from Hatherley, not from anyone who can be interpreted as speaking for House Westerdale. Agreed. Appendix C must be present when this becomes public. Agreed. Peter must be allowed to answer openly. If he is prevented from speaking, he will say he was condemned by ducal authority rather than evidence. Rufus, his mouth hardened, but he nodded. Agreed. Any restitution must be calculated separately from this investigation's effect on your reputation. Explain. Do not announce money as charity from the Duke after the fact. If relief was improperly diverted, it is owed, not gifted. Something in Rufus's expression changed. Respect, perhaps. Agreed. And before Peter is exposed, you acknowledge your own errors. This one took longer. Publicly. Yes. Both of them? Both. What I said to you at the beginning, and what I did at the luncheon. Yes. Rufus looked down for a moment, then back at her. Agreed. Lilian crossed her arms loosely. That does not restore trust. I know you cannot repair 5 days of harm by saying yes 5 times. I know. Then what do you expect? Nothing. The answer was so immediate that it disarmed her. Rufus continued quietly. You told me once that motives can change. While we are looking elsewhere, I think trust can as well, but not because I demand to know when it has happened. He held her gaze. Then I shall keep agreeing when no one is watching. The room seemed very still. Lilian had imagined this apology more than once since the luncheon. In some versions he defended himself. In others he offered power in a different form, or protection softened into romance, or some eloquent declaration designed to make her responsible for easing his shame. He did none of those things. He simply stood before her with no shield except the truth of what he had done. The anger in her did not disappear. Something else moved around it. Something warmer, more dangerous because it had survived disappointment. Mrs. Hale came yesterday, Lilian said. Rufus nodded once. I was told only that she came voluntarily and left safely. You did not ask why. You told me not to. She wants to speak publicly at the next benefit payment. Rufus's expression sharpened, but he did not interrupt. She will bring her original receipt herself. She wants the right to leave if she changes her mind. She has it. Mrs. Dyer and Mrs. Pritchard have sent no word. Then no one will approach them. Lilian felt a pressure behind her ribs ease. Good. Rufus's voice lowered. Is there anything else? There was? She had not planned it. That mattered. Planning would have made it strategy, and this was not. Lilian stepped toward him. Rufus went still. She stopped close enough to see the fatigue at the corners of his eyes, the restraint in the way he kept his hands at his sides. He did not reach for her. Lilian. She ignored the return to her given name because this time it did not feel like possession. It felt like uncertainty. She closed the final distance herself and put her arms around him. Rufus did not move at first. The pause was brief, but she felt it. He was waiting, giving her the chance to change her mind even after she had begun. Lilian tightened her arms around him. Only then did his hands settle carefully at her back. The embrace was warm, quiet, and far more intimate than the hand they had held beneath the beech trees. There was no gratitude in it, no forgiveness complete enough to erase what had happened. It was an acknowledgement that trust, damaged and unfinished, had not died. Rufus let out a slow breath against her hair. I did not expect this. Neither did I. His hold remained gentle. Should I let go? Lilian closed her eyes for one heartbeat. Not yet, so he did not. They stood together until the moment felt chosen rather than accidental, until Lilian was the one who finally stepped back. Rufus released her at once. Neither tried to turn the embrace into more than it was. No kiss, no confession. Those would have been too easy and too soon. Lilian smoothed one hand over the front of her dress, gathering herself. Benefit day is 4 days away. Yes, Peter will prepare for it. So will we. She gave him a look. Rufus corrected himself. You will. I will be where you ask me to be. This time she smiled openly. Before either could say more, Hatherley appeared at the open doorway, holding a folded note. Forgive me, Your Grace. Miss Tarrant. He looked toward Lilian. Mrs. Hale has sent word. She wishes it recorded that she intends to speak on Benefit Day, and that she will bring her original receipt in her own possession. Lilian took a slow breath. The first witness had chosen her place. The evidence would not be borrowed from her. The truth would come into the yard on its own feet. On the 23rd of November, the day before Blackmere Benefit Day, Lilian discovered that society could make a threat sound almost like concern. Lady Ethel Bassett, found her shortly after noon in the long gallery at Ewbank Hall, where weak winter light lay across the portraits and turned the glass over their faces pale. Lilian had been on her way to Mr. Hatherley's office to confirm that the original report, Mrs. Hale's compensation notice, and Appendix C remained secured for the following morning. Mrs. Hale had already renewed her intention to attend and bring her own original receipt. Mrs. Dyer had sent word before breakfast that she would come as well, though she reserved the right not to speak if fear overcame her. Mrs. Pritchard had sent nothing. Lilian had asked no one to press her. Lady Ethel stepped from beside a window seat with the composed grace of a woman who believed she was offering practical wisdom. "Miss Tarrant, may I have a moment?" Lilian stopped. "Of course." Ethel glanced toward the distant footman before lowering her voice. "I understand you intend to appear at Blackmere tomorrow." "Yes." "At the pay yard?" "Yes." A faint line appeared between Ethel's brows. "Among miners, widows, clerks, and men discussing wages and debts." "That is generally where wages and debts are understood. You know perfectly well what I mean." Lilian did. That was why she waited. Ethel sighed. "I am not your enemy, whatever you may think." "I have not said you are." "Then listen. A woman may survive being thought eccentric. She may even survive being thought ambitious if she is discreet about it. But respectable society remembers scenes. It remembers where a woman stood, what subjects she discussed, who heard her speak, and whether she seemed too comfortable among matters considered improper for her sex." Lilian met her gaze. "And you believe I should remain here? I believe you have already proved enough." "Enough for whom?" "For yourself." "That is not the purpose of tomorrow." Ethel's expression sharpened. "You think people will admire you for standing in a mine yard and questioning Mr. Fossett about widow payments. I do not require admiration. No woman requires it until she discovers what life feels like without respectability." Lilian heard the fear beneath Ethel's certainty then. Not concern for Lilian exactly. Concern for the rules upon which Ethel had built her own safety. "Respectable memory has survived worse things than truth," Lilian said. Ethel's lips parted. Lilian continued before the exchange could become cruel. "I understand what you are warning me about. I also understand that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Dyer have far more to lose tomorrow than I do. If they can stand there, I will not hide in Ewbank because society may find the subject unattractive." Ethel looked at her for a long moment. "And His Grace permits this?" Lilian felt the question like a small test. "His Grace does not permit my choices." Ethel's eyes changed. She had expected something else. "You speak very confidently of him." "I speak confidently of myself." Lilian inclined her head and continued toward Hatherley's office, leaving Lady Ethel alone among the painted women whose reputations had been preserved because no one could hear what they had once been forbidden to say. Rufus came to her later in the afternoon, after Hatherley confirmed that the papers would remain in his locked document case until he personally carried them to Blackmere the next morning. He found Lilian in the smaller drawing room with Mrs. Bell in the adjoining chamber. The November sky had darkened early, and 2 lamps had been lit despite the hour. Rufus remained by the doorway until Lilian looked up. "May I speak with you?" "Yes." He entered, closing no door that had been left open. "I have arranged tomorrow's carriages." "Thank you. Hatherley will bring the documents himself." "Nothing leaves his custody until the proceedings begin." "Good." Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Dyer have both confirmed they intend to come. Lilian nodded. "Mrs. Pritchard?" "No word." "Then no one goes to her." "No one will." He hesitated. "There is one thing I want to ask." Lilian set aside the paper she had been reading. "Ask. Do you want this move to Eubank?" She frowned. "Why?" "Because once the questioning begins in the pay yard, you will be standing before workers, families, estate men, local witnesses, Fossett, and anyone else who finds reason to attend. At Eubank, I can control the room more easily. That is precisely why it should not be at Eubank." "I thought you might say that." "Then why ask?" "Because I wanted the answer to be yours." The simplicity of it reached her more quickly than any polished reassurance could have done. Rufus came no nearer. "If you choose Blackmere, I will not move it." "I choose Blackmere. Very well." Lilian studied him. "You dislike that too?" "Profoundly. Because you cannot control it." "Partly." His honesty surprised a quiet smile from her. He continued, "And because if this fails tomorrow, society will blame you before it blames me." Her smile disappeared. He had named the danger without disguising it. "Yes, Fossett will say you overreached. Lady Ethel will not be the only person to suggest you made yourself improper. Men who would never risk their own reputations for frightened women will explain that you should have been more prudent." "I know." Rufus's jaw tightened. "I can absorb that kind of judgment more easily than you can. That does not make it yours to absorb." "No." He looked down briefly, then back at her. "I know that now." Lilian rose. They were several feet apart. The distance felt deliberate rather than cold. "Then do not rescue me from the risk I have chosen." Rufus held her gaze. "I promise, even if Peter humiliates me. Yes, even if Mrs. Hale changes her mind. Yes, even if Mrs. Dyer refuses to speak. Yes, even if Mrs. Pritchard never appears." His answer came more quietly. "Yes." Lilian drew a slow breath. "Good." For a moment neither spoke. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, Rufus remained where he was, and something in his expression made Lilian wait. "There is another thing," he said. His voice had changed. Not lowered theatrically, simply stripped of the formal certainty he wore so easily in public. "What is it?" "I have wanted to kiss you." Lilian went still. Rufus did not move toward her. "Since when?" The question escaped with more warmth than she intended. A faint, almost rueful smile touched his face. "Long enough to know wanting it does not give me leave." The air between them suddenly smaller. Lilian remembered his hand around hers beneath the beech trees, his stillness before returning her embrace. The way he had learned, painfully and imperfectly, to ask where he had once assumed. Rufus's eyes stayed on hers. "May I?" No rank stood inside the question. No protection, no reward. Only a man asking a woman whether she wanted the same thing. Lilian felt her pulse quicken, but she did not look away. "Yes." Rufus still did not close the distance. He waited one final heartbeat, giving the answer room to remain an answer rather than become momentum. Lilian stepped toward him herself. That was the choice she wanted him to understand. She closed the last space between them. Rufus lifted one hand slowly, stopping near her cheek until she leaned into the touch. Only then did his fingers rest lightly along her jaw. His kiss was gentle at first, almost cautious, and Lilian answered it without hesitation. There was no urgency in it, no attempt to claim what had been given. Only warmth, restraint, and the unmistakable recognition that neither of them was pretending any longer. When they drew apart, Rufus kept his hand still until Lilian turned her face slightly, choosing the contact once more before he lowered it. "I was afraid," he admitted, "that asking would make the moment less." Lilian's mouth curved. "Did it?" "No." "Good. You are very fond of that word. You improve when you hear it." A quiet laugh escaped him. The sound eased something in her chest. He did not kiss her again. She was grateful for that too. One kiss had said enough for tonight. Tomorrow required clarity. "Benefit day," she said. "At dawn." Rufus nodded. "At Blackmere." "Where I chose, where you chose." A footman appeared at the open doorway with a message for Hatherley. Rufus stepped back immediately, restoring the proper distance between them. Lilian accepted the interruption with equal composure. The note was brief. Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Dyer would attend. Mrs. Pritchard had still given no answer. Rufus looked at Lilian, but he did not suggest sending anyone after her. Lilian folded the message and handed it back. "Then tomorrow we proceed with 2. Rufus nodded. Neither of them knew whether the third widow would come. Neither tried to force the uncertainty closed. By dawn, the Blackmere pay bell would ring, and whatever truth emerged would have to arrive by choice. At dawn on the 24th of November, the Blackmere pay bell carried across the mine yard before the sun had fully cleared the low Derbyshire hills. Men came from the workings with coal dust still caught in the seams of their coats. Widows gathered near the pay office with shawls drawn tightly against the cold. Estate clerks stood beside a long table beneath the covered side of the yard, and several neighbouring landowners had come at Rufus's invitation, not as judges but as witnesses to whatever followed. Lady Ethel Bassett stood near the Dowager Duchess, composed and pale. Peter Fossett arrived with 2 company clerks and the contained confidence of a man who had spent the previous night preparing explanations. Lilian came in the Ewbank carriage with Mrs. Bell and the Dowager Duchess. She carried only her working notes and her father's steel dip pen in its worn walnut holder. The original 18-page report was not with her. Mr. Hatherley brought it separately in his locked document case, together with Mrs. Hale's compensation notice and the sealed folder containing Appendix C of the Blackmere lease. Mrs. Hale arrived on foot from the cottages with her own original receipt folded inside her reticule. Mrs. Dyer came several minutes later, holding hers herself. Mrs. Pritchard had still sent no word. Rufus did not ask anyone to fetch her. When the bell stopped, conversations thinned into silence. Peter looked toward the table. "Your Grace, before this becomes a spectacle, I must protest that ordinary company accounts are being treated as wrongdoing because Miss Tarrant dislikes their appearance." Rufus faced him. "You will have every opportunity to answer, and Miss Tarrant will speak for herself." Lilian heard the deliberate simplicity of it. Rufus then turned toward the gathered workers, families, estate officers, and local witnesses. His voice carried without effort. "Before any evidence concerning Mr. Fossett is heard, there are 2 matters concerning my own conduct that must be stated plainly." Peter's expression altered. Lady Ethel looked sharply toward him. Rufus continued. "When Miss Tarrant first questioned the Blackmere accounts, I dismissed her judgment. Because she was a woman, I had already praised the report she wrote, without knowing she was its author. Yet I told her the matter belonged to men." No one moved. Rufus did not soften the admission. Later, when her credibility was attacked, I placed ducal authority around her work without asking her consent. I told myself I was defending her. In fact, I made her independent inquiry appear to serve my reputation and my house. He looked toward Lilian. "Both actions were mine. Both were wrong." Then he stepped back. He did not explain further. He did not ask the crowd to admire the confession. He left the space to her. Hatherley opened his document case. "Miss Tarrant?" Lilian approached the table. He removed the original report first, and placed it before her without surrendering custody of the remaining papers. "This report," Lilian said, "was delivered to Miss Hatherley on the 31st of October, before His Grace knew who had written it, and before any question of ducal appointment arose." Hatherley confirmed the date. Lilian turned to Peter. "Do you dispute that?" "No." "Do you dispute the relief figures recorded in your company books?" "I dispute the interpretation, not the figures." Peter's mouth tightened. "Not the figures." Hatherley next removed Mrs. Hale's compensation notice from its protective wrapper. He held it while Lilian read aloud the sentence concerning unsettled company accounts and continued occupation. Then he opened Appendix C and read the clause forbidding Duke-funded widow relief from being diminished by cottage arrears, advances, company charges, or other liabilities without separate settlement outside the relief payment. Peter shook his head. "And I have never denied the clause. The women agreed to settle their debts." "After receiving the relief," Lilian asked, "as part of the same account, that is not the same answer. It is perfectly ordinary." Lilian turned to Mrs. Hale. "You do not have to speak." Mrs. Hale's hand trembled around her reticule. "I know. And if you wish to leave now, you may. I know that too." Slowly, the widow stepped forward and removed her receipt herself. She placed it on the table without giving it to anyone. "That's mine. I signed it." Peter seized upon the words. "Precisely." Lilian looked at him. "No one has claimed otherwise." She turned back to Mrs. Hale. "How much relief was written there?" £3. "How much cash did you take home?" £1 and 11 shillings. "What happened to the remainder?" Mrs. Hale swallowed. "They told me it settled the cottage and Thomas's company account." "Did you believe you could refuse?" Peter interrupted. "Belief is not evidence." Lilian looked toward him. "You will answer in a moment." Then she returned her attention to Mrs. Hale. "Did you believe you could refuse?" "No." "Why?" Mrs. Hale looked toward the compensation notice, because the notice said unsettled accounts could affect the cottage. "Mr. Fossett came after you visited us and said people who caused trouble shouldn't expect favors when accounts were reviewed." Peter's face hardened. "I said no such thing as a threat." Mrs. Hale looked at him for the first time. "You didn't have to." The words moved through the yard more powerfully than an accusation shouted could have done. Mrs. Dyer stepped forward next. Her voice was quieter. Mine was the same. £2 and 10 shillings written down, £1 and 6 shillings given to me. They said the rest cleared what was owing. I signed because I thought, if I didn't, the account would remain against my cottage. She placed her original receipt beside Mrs. Hale's and kept one hand on it. Peter looked from one woman to the other. "Their signatures are genuine." Lilian nodded. "Yes." He seemed almost startled. "Then, what exactly are you accusing me of?" The question was never whether they signed. The question was what refusing to sign would have cost them. She indicated the notice, then Appendix C, then the receipts. Your own system placed housing insecurity beside a relief payment protected from company deductions. The entries were processed together. The women did not receive the full relief and later choose, separately and freely, to repay you. The benefit was absorbed into company debt before they left the pay office. Peter's voice sharpened. That proves accounting practice, not coercion. Then explain why the company noticed connected unsettled accounts with continued occupation, a general condition. Precisely. Lilian's voice remained calm. A condition every widow understood before she signed. Hatherley produced the renewal accounts he had examined over the previous days. He stated that Blackmere's cash position had worsened during the autumn, and that Peter's renewal request depended heavily upon presenting lower outstanding company debts and stronger apparent profitability. No hidden confession was needed. The figures supplied motive. Peter opened his mouth to respond. Before he could, a movement at the edge of the crowd drew every eye. Mrs. Pritchard stood there, breathless from walking quickly, her brown dress darkened at the hem by the road. She clutched a folded receipt in one hand. Lilian did not move toward her. "Mrs. Pritchard," she said, "you do not have to do this." The widow looked at Peter, then at Lilian. "I know." She came forward anyway. "At luncheon I said I might have made things sound worse." Her voice shook. "I didn't. I was afraid." She placed her receipt beside the other two. "They told me the same thing. Clear the account or risk the cottage." Peter's control finally cracked. 3 frightened women cannot overturn an entire commercial arrangement. Rufus answered from behind Lilian. "No, but the lease can." He stepped forward only after Lilian had finished. "And the lease will." His voice was cold now, but not uncontrolled. "Mr. Fossett, your Blackmere lease will not be renewed. Mr. Hatherley will conduct a full accounting of every widow relief payment affected by these deductions. Any sum improperly diverted will be restored as money owed, not charity granted." Hatherley nodded. "The accounting begins today." Rufus looked toward the company clerks. "Blackmere will continue under temporary management while new arrangements are made. The workers will not be abandoned because their lessee failed them." Peter stared at him. "You would damage the mine for 3 complaints?" Lilian answered before Rufus could. "No, you damaged trust by making poverty serve as consent." Peter had nothing left that did not sound like repetition. Lady Ethel shifted as though preparing to leave. Rufus stopped her with a look. "Lady Ethel." She froze. "You were not part of Mr. Fossett's accounts." "No, Your Grace. But you repeated the fear surrounding these women as social amusement and used Miss Tarrant's visits to their cottages to suggest impropriety." Colour rose into Ethel's face. "I believed I was defending respectable boundaries." "You were defending comfort." Lilian looked at her. Ethel's pride fought visibly with humiliation. At last she said, "Then I retract what I implied about Miss Tarrant. It was not friendship. It was enough." Hatherley began returning each receipt to its owner. Mrs. Hale took hers. Mrs. Dyer took hers. Mrs. Pritchard took hers. Then the solicitor placed the original anonymous report before Lilian. "Miss Tarrant, this remains the document you submitted." Lilian reached into her reticule and removed the steel dip pen that had belonged to her father. Hatherley supplied ink. The yard was quiet as she opened the report to its first page. For weeks the work had existed without a name because anonymity had been the price of being read. She no longer needed that protection. Lilian dipped the pen, touched it carefully to the paper, and wrote beneath the title in her own hand, "Lilian Tarrant." No duke announced it. No man granted it. She placed the pen beside the report and looked up. Rufus was watching her, not with pride of ownership, but with something far more vulnerable. Later, when the yard had begun to empty, and Hatherley had secured the report again for return to the estate archive, Rufus found Lilian beside the quiet carriage track with Mrs. Bell visible near the waiting carriage. He stopped several paces away. "May I say something that has nothing to do with Blackmere?" Lilian's heart shifted. "Yes." Rufus drew a breath. "I love you, Lilian. Not because you taught me to be a better duke. Because you are the woman I want beside me when being better is difficult." For once, she had no careful answer prepared. She stepped closer and lifted one hand to his cheek. Rufus did not move until her palm rested there. Lilian smiled through the sudden brightness in her eyes. "I love you too, Rufus." His expression changed with such naked relief that she felt her own composure break into a quiet laugh. He opened his arms only slightly, asking without words. Lilian stepped into them. The embrace was warm, mutual, and unhurried. When they finally drew apart, Rufus kept his hands lightly at her arms until she looked up. "May I court you properly?" he asked. "Not because of what happened today. Not because I owe you anything. Because I love you." Lilian let him wait one heartbeat. Yes. This time, when he smiled, there was no certainty in it at all, only joy. 6 weeks after Blackmere Benefit Day, the first thing Lilian noticed was not that Peter Fossett had gone, nor that the mine accounts had been reopened under temporary management, nor even that the 3 widows whose receipts had helped expose the deduction system had begun receiving money that had never been charity in the first place. It was that Mrs. Hale's old compensation notice was back where it belonged. Mr. Hatherley had made a certified transcription for the Eubank estate records, recorded the document's return, and personally delivered the original to Mrs. Hale before Christmas. No one had retained it because it had become useful. No one had transformed a widow's paper into permanent ducal property. That small act pleased Lilian more than any speech made after the inquiry. By early January, Blackmere was still operating. The workers had not been punished for Peter's conduct. A temporary manager, appointed under the estate's existing authority, oversaw wages and relief, while Hatherley completed the accounting and Rufus considered new lease terms. The offending practice of treating widow relief as an immediate source for company deductions had ceased. Restitution had begun case by case, with each sum entered as money owed rather than benevolence bestowed by House Westerdale. Rufus had insisted upon that language, because Lilian had insisted upon the principle. More important to her, he had not taken credit for remembering it. The morning she received a letter from Hatherley asking whether she would review the next Blackmere relief statement. The request came with written terms. She would act independently. Her conclusions would carry her own name. She would receive payment for the work. The estate would not alter or publish her report without her consent. Rufus had not drafted the conditions for her. Hatherley had written them after asking what she required. Lilian read the page twice before signing. When Rufus called that afternoon, he did not ask whether she was grateful. He asked whether the terms were satisfactory. "Almost," she said. They were walking in the Eubank conservatory, with the Dowager Duchess and Mrs. Bell seated well within sight at the far end. Rufus stopped. "What have I missed?" Lilian handed him the copied terms. One clause was marked lightly in pencil. "It says the estate may request revisions. That seems ordinary. Request? Yes. Require? No." He read the line again. "You are right. You agreed very quickly. I'm still practicing." She smiled. The weeks since Blackmere had changed the quality of their courtship without making it less formal. Rufus visited openly. He sent no extravagant gifts. He did not attempt to purchase intimacy with jewels or favors. They walked, read newspapers beside the Dowager Duchess's fire, discussed estate matters when Lilian chose to discuss them, and sometimes spoke of nothing more important than whether the cook had finally admitted defeat over an over-salted soup. He had kissed her only when she welcomed it. He had never treated the kiss at Blackmere as permission forever after. That restraint had become, strangely, one of the things she trusted most. He folded the document and handed it back. Hatherley will change it. Good. Rufus looked at her for a long moment. There is another request I would like to make. Lilian felt the seriousness before he spoke. Is it going to require a solicitor? Eventually, her heartbeat changed. Rufus did not kneel immediately. Instead, he looked almost uncertain, which moved her more deeply than practiced confidence would have done. When I first knew you, he said, I thought love would mean knowing what should be done for someone and doing it quickly enough to spare them difficulty. Lilian remained silent. You have disabused me of that notion with considerable efficiency. I've had practice. A faint smile touched his face. Then it disappeared. I do not want to ask you to marry me, because you need my name. You proved rather conclusively that you do not. I do not want to offer you protection as though it were a bargain, and I do not want gratitude for Blackmere, because the truth was yours before I had the sense to hear it. He took one breath. I want a life with you. I want your arguments when I deserve them, your judgment when I am too certain, your laughter when I am intolerable, and your hand when you choose to give it. Only then did he lower himself to one knee. Will you choose a life with me in which I keep learning to ask? Lilian's eyes stung before she could prevent it. She looked at the man who had once mistaken authority for understanding, and who now waited without assuming that love entitled him to her answer. Yes, she said. Relief broke across his face so openly that she laughed through the tears she had refused to shed. Yes, Rufus, I'll marry you. He rose, but did not seize her. May I kiss you? You may. This time she met him halfway. The engagement that followed was proper, public, and entirely without haste, disguised as romance. Settlements were discussed with solicitors. Lilian read every page. Rufus expected her to. The bans were published. The Dowager Duchess managed invitations with formidable restraint, rejecting half the county's attempts to turn the marriage into a spectacle. By February, Lilian Tarrant became Lilian Westerstale, Duchess of Ashminster, before family, friends, and witnesses, who understood that the title altered her social station without rewriting the woman who had entered the church. Early spring brought thin sunlight to Ewbank and the first suggestion of green along the sheltered borders. One morning, Lilian sat in the bright morning room, with the new annual Blackmere Relief Report open before her. The final draft had been prepared from the corrected accounts and reviewed under the terms she had negotiated. Her father's steel dip pen rested in her hand, the walnut holder still dark where years of use had worn it smooth. At the bottom of the final page, a clerk had written the proposed attribution. Lilian Westerdale, Duchess of Ashminster, formerly Lilian Tarrant, author of the Blackmere Report. Lilian read it once and frowned. Rufus, standing several feet away near the window, noticed but did not approach the desk. Something wrong. Something unnecessary. She drew a neat line through the explanatory phrase. Formerly Lilian Tarrant, author of the Blackmere Report, disappeared beneath one deliberate stroke. Then, beneath it, in her own hand, she wrote simply, Lilian Westerstale. She looked at the name for a moment. Marriage had changed it. It had not erased anything that came before. The report did not require a footnote explaining that she had once been worthy of being read without a duchess's title. Her work could stand on the same ground her life now did, chosen, acknowledged, and still her own. Rufus waited until she capped the ink and laid the steel pen beside the pages. May I read it? Lilian looked up at him. The question brought back the lower hall in November, the anonymous report in his hands. The certainty, with which he had once decided what belonged to men. So much had changed because he had learned that asking was not weakness. She smiled. "Now you may." She lifted the report and placed it in his hands herself. Rufus took it carefully, as though the choice mattered as much as the pages. He had read only the first paragraph when Lilian rose, crossed the space between them, and caught the front of his coat. He looked up in surprise. "Have I missed an error already?" "Yes. Where?" "You are too far away." Before he could answer, she drew him toward her and kissed him first. Rufus laughed softly against the kiss before returning it, warm and unhurried, one hand settling at her waist only after she leaned closer. When they parted, his forehead rested briefly against hers. "I love you," he said. Lilian touched his cheek, smiling. "I love you too." On the desk behind them, her father's steel pen rested beside the fresh Blackmere report, her name written clearly beneath the work. In Rufus's hands were the pages he had been invited to read. Nothing had been taken. Nothing needed to be granted. The woman whose mind had once required anonymity now stood in her own home, loved without being absorbed, while the Duke beside her understood at last that the finest privilege she could give him was not the right to speak for her, but the trust of being allowed to listen.